Welcome to my project on zooplankton biodiversity. So in order to discuss biodiversity of zooplankton, we have to define biodiversity and diversity. And how I did this was I looked at the most simplest of terms. I defined it as the variety of life that exists in the world. Now, in this video, we are concerned with the diversity of the zooplankton. So we will investigate further. So in order to understand this very complex and diverse group of animals, we must put these into two main groups. And there are two main groups of zooplankton. They are the holoplankton, which exists as plankton their whole life. One example of holoplankton are jellyfish, which are the largest example of any zooplankton. The other main category are meroplankton, those of which that are plankton in the larval stage, so they're only plankton for parts of their lives. One example of meroplankton are mussel larvae. And we must find categories to put these in order to understand this large group of species. And there are many different traits that help tell these species and groups apart. And in this video, we will focus on four main ones. That is the feeding methods, taxonomy, size, and life cycles. So focusing on feeding and what these animals eat and how they differ in their methods of feeding and grazing, we'll be looking at four examples, all different types of zooplankton that feed in using different mechanisms and feed on different prey. So, zooplankton can use water currents to help feed. They could be filter feeders. They could use phagocytosis, which is an engulfing method of their prey. They could use cilia and flagellum to obtain their prey. They could use pundicle, or they could be raptorial, or they could be using a mucus home that also engulfs the prey. So now we will be looking at four different examples of zooplankton that have different modes of feeding. The first one is an example of a filter feeder, and it is Pleurosigga minima. It's a chainoflagellate, and it uses flagella to create a water current, which the water current carries the prey up into its collar, which is shown by the kind of net, and that captures the prey. The next feeding method we're going to discuss are using cilia, and a zooplankton species that uses cilia is Aglantha digitale, which is a type of hydromedusa. And it uses cilia on the ends of the tentacles to create a water current, which then brings the prey closer, and then the tentacles intercept the food. It somewhat resembles a jellyfish. The third feeding method that we're going to discuss are mucus feeders. And one example is a type of larvation, and it's called Oikoplerodioica. And mucus feeders are really unique in the way that they consume their food. They produce this mucus substance that helps them become very large sometimes too, and they can shed that during the day, and it helps them collect as much food as possible. And this one in particular uses its tail to pump water and prey up through its mucus and filters out the food that way. So the fourth and final method of feeding that we're going to discuss are active predation, which a zooplankton by the name of Sagitta, it's a type of chaetonath, uses, and it uses hooks and spines right up at the top, right near their mouth, to grab their prey, and it can swim in short bursts to hunt down prey. It also has these receptors that can sense prey, and then it can go out and get it. So this is an active type of feeding, unlike some of the filter feeders or other zooplankton. So when thinking about these different feeding methods of all these zooplankton that can help us categorize them. We also must think of clearance rates and filtration rates. And the clearance rate, or grazing rate, is the measure of the volume of water from which particles are completely removed. It's a measure of efficiency. And the other factor we have to think about is the filtration rate, which is the total volume of water passing through the filter apparatus per unit time. For all these different methods, there are trade-offs for amount of energy expended, nutrition of food that is obtained. So no matter if you're an active or passive feeder, there are always these trade-offs, advantages and disadvantages. So next up in our discovery of zooplankton diversity, we are going to dive right into some taxonomic categories of zooplankton. And these are divided up based on physical attributes and appearance. And the three main taxonomic groups, most common ones at least, are rotifers, cladocerans, and copepods. So the first taxonomic group that we will be looking at are the rotifers, phylum Rotifera. And these zooplankton are relatively small, about 100 to 500 microns in length, and they have two distinctive features. One is that there is an area towards their head that a lot of cilia are near, that are used for locomotion and feeding. And they also have two jaw parts called mastax. And there's roughly about 2,000 species, so there's a lot of them. And the shape of them resembles a wheel, hence the name rotifer. So here is the first example of a rotifer species, and the species is Plateus quadricornis. And as you can see in the picture, you can really see the circular shape of the species, hence the rotifer name. And you can also see up by the head on the left the two mandible-looking parts, the mastax, that they use for feeding. That's our first example of a rotifer species. So here's our second example of a rotifer zooplankton species called the conchylus. And this is actually a colony of zooplankton. And you see that when they're all arranged around this center point with all their tails, it really resembles that rotifer wheel. The second taxonomic group we will be investigating are the cladocerans. And they're categorized by having a size range from about 500 microns to about 6 millimeters in length. And two very distinguishable traits about cladocerans are they have a compound eye and a large carapace that extends the whole length of its thorax pretty much. And they're most commonly referred to as water fleas. And you will see that based on the shape of them in coming slides. They're usually selective feeders, and there are over 650 species of cladocerans. And fun fact, only about 8 of them are truly oceanic. So the first cladoceran species we'll be looking at is the Daphnia magna. Now, the Daphnia family of the cladocerans is one of the most widely studied zooplankton and well-known zooplankton species or family. And like stated before, they really do look like water fleas. And you can also see the very distinctive compound eye on the left, which actually helps them be selective feeders so they can see their prey and kind of decide whether or not they want to obtain that prey, if it might not be nutritious enough for them. But that's our first example. Our second example of the cladoceran species is a species called Evadne spinifera. And as you saw in the last example, you can really see the prominent compound eye in the middle. Also, the very large carapace that covers the whole thorax area. And this species prefers warm waters and can also range from many other colors. It could be gray, it could be opaque, or it could be yellow. The third class of zooplankton that we're going to look into are copepods. And copepods are small little crustaceans. Could be freshwater or aquatic, or oceanic. Their size ranges from about 500 microns up to 2 millimeters. And they're characterized for being mostly transparent, usually cylinder body shape. They have large antennae used for swimming. They lack compound eyes, but they have one single eye usually. And they have many small appendages on their thorax, usually around 6. So there are over 13,000 species of copepods, but in this video we're only going to be discussing 2 examples. First example is the Acardiotonsa, and this is a picture of the Acardiotonsa. As you can see, the very prominent antennae at the top, and then also you can see right underneath on his thorax the appendages that come out. You can also see how it is semi-transparent in appearance. The second example of a copepod species is the Calanus guaiacalis. And this is an Arctic copepod species, usually ranging from about 3 to 6 millimeters in length. Usually has about 1 to 3 year life cycle, and you can really see the 2 antennae on this species that are usually used for swimming, and you can also see its cylindrical body shape pretty prominently in this picture. So the size of zooplankton can also be used to group species and help kind of map out the whole diversity of zooplankton. And in general, zooplankton range in size from micrometers, really small microscopic organisms, to, in some cases for large jellyfish, multiple meters long. And in this video we will be investigating 2 separate groups. One being macroplankton, which range in size from 20 to about 200 millimeters, and megaplankton, which are any zooplankton species that are over 200 millimeters. So the first group we're going to look at are the macroplankton. Those are which range from 20 to 200 millimeters in length and can include some large crustaceans and some jellyfish also. It's also the second largest group of zooplankton, right under megaplankton, which we will talk about next. The first species of macroplankton that we will discuss is the Mysis duliviana, or the common name is the opossum shrimp. And it's a small shrimp, it's about 20 millimeters in length. It lives in cold, deep lakes and in some estuaries also. The largest group of plankton that we will talk about is the megaplankton, and they're characterized by being over 200 millimeters in length. And this is where most of the big jellyfish are categorized in, and it is the largest group. The first species of megaplankton that we will explore is the Aurelia aureata, also known as the moon jelly. And it is one of the most common types of jellyfish, at least around New England. I remember growing up seeing them all over the place in Hingham Harbor, growing up and picking them up and putting them back in. And they're very transparent in color and a great example of the largest group of plankton that there are. Another option for defining diversity and categorizing the zooplankton are thinking about life cycles. And it's a great way to differentiate between zooplankton species because some of them have different life cycles, and there are 2 main types. We discussed them earlier briefly, but one is meroplankton, which are zooplankton that eventually become different animals. So they're in their larval form as zooplankton, such as different worms, crustaceans, and clams. They all have um, a larval form as a zooplankton. The other main type are holoplankton, which remain zooplankton for their whole lives. And obviously there are more complex life stages or life cycles for zooplankton, but we're going to keep it as simple as possible for this video. One example of a meroplankton species, so a species that has a larval form as a zooplankton, is the spiny lobster larva. And this species of lobster is more a warm water species. And as you can see by the shape of the larva, it somewhat resembles its adult stage as a lobster, but some meroplankton species, their larva stage does not look remotely like their adult stage. So another meroplankton species example is the larva of a sea cucumber, which doesn't really look at all like the adult version of a sea cucumber, which is quite the opposite of the spiny lobster larva, which we just looked at. So on the other hand, um, differing from meroplankton in their life cycle, holoplankton are plankton for their whole life. So here's an example of a holoplankton species. It is a Tompterus, which is a type of polycate worm, which you can see has some beautiful bioluminescence too. So to summarize, in this video we defined diversity in very simple terms to start off. There are many ways scientists can group zooplankton in order to better understand them, but I thought it was better to just focus on the basics and investigate 4 different ways of defining and differentiating between zooplankton. We looked at zooplankton with different feeding methods. We looked at taxonomic differences. We looked at size differences. We also looked at life cycles of different zooplankton in order to better understand them and better place them into the more accurate groups that they should be put in.